Hi everybody, in this video we're going to look at something really cool and really awesome, and that thing is if and else statements. These statements are the first of several statements we're going to be looking at that help bring some order and control to the code that we've been writing so far. So let's get started. So you might be wondering, what does it mean to bring some order and bring some control to the code that we're writing? Well, the way I'm going to explain it is by taking a few steps back and not looking at code in terms of lines and characters that we write in a code editor and then run in the browser, but think of code as something more fluid, something that is more like water. And we all know what water looks like, but I wanted to show this picture because it's really cool. It's of like the Pacific Ocean from outer space. So water's cool, outer space is cool. Combine them both and you get this really cool picture. But really the thing I want to bring up is actually this. Is that by default, the water has no structure. It just goes wherever it is taken. It takes up whatever space its container provides. You have a glass of water, the water is going to be in the shape of whatever glass it is in. If you spill some water on your table, it'll be a puddle, or if your table's kind of uneven or wobbly, the water will just go wherever the table's contours end up taking it. The thing is, water is very aimless, but the thing is, it doesn't have to be that way. You can actually control the water, and by controlling it, as you well know, people have created some pretty cool things over the years. A great example is probably my favorite example of cool engineering things, and it is the Hoover Dam. Basically the Colorado River just running, and then we were able to control it and do some really cool things that help power a large part of the Western United States. You can build little island resorts. You have swimming pools. In this case, Olympic-sized swimming pools. Then you have like the smaller swimming pools. But the main thing is that the water was just water, but by adding some structure around it, by using some creativity, you're able to harness it to do some things that you might not have thought about doing by default. And the tying it back to why we're talking about it is that the code we write really isn't that much different. Yes, the code we've written so far has just been statements and functions and things that just basically execute in a simple row. But the thing is, real code doesn't have to be that way. Just like the water, you can actually control it by adding a lot of branching, structuring, routing, and more. And this sounds very abstract, but you'll start making a little bit more sense as you start getting into some of the examples. And there's a term for what helps bring all these things to life, and that is control structures. And the first control structure we're going to look at is, you guessed it, if and else statements. So an if and else statement allows you to run some code based on whether a condition is true or false. And I know this makes absolutely no sense, so let's take it back to something you do in the real world every day. By the time you wake up and by the time you decide to step outside, you make many decisions. And a lot of decisions end up taking the form of what is essentially an if or else statement. You ask yourself a question and you decide what to do depending on what the answer to that question is. So for example, as I have this little slide here, is the weather cold today? That might be a reasonable question to ask in the morning to help determine what you want to wear. And if the weather is cold today, the answer is true, you wear something warm. If the weather is not cold today, in which case the answer is false, you don't wear something warm. And this form of basically making decisions is something that you do dozens, hundreds, if not thousands of times during a day, and some of these don't even happen consciously. Your mind subconsciously does things that fall in a similar bucket. And if those kinds of decisions you're making in the real world, there's a very good chance you'll make those kind of decisions in the coding world as well. And that's where the if and else statements come in. The way you should think about an if and else statement is by breaking it up into two halves. The first half is what happens when a decision is true, and the second half is what happens when a decision you want to make, the condition you're checking against, ends up becoming false. So the way you do this is this. You write the letters if for if, and in parentheses, you provide an expression. And this expression can be anything. It can be a number, it can be a variable, it can be a more complex expression. And the result that JavaScript is looking for is whether that expression ends up evaluating to true or false. If it evaluates to true, in this case, the do something, the item directly under the if statement, that statement will execute as part of the true condition. And if the expression that we provide ends up evaluating to false, then the value we provide under the else statement, the do something different in this case, is what gets executed. Now, that seems pretty simple, but many examples of what you end up creating in if and else statements aren't just simple expressions that evaluate to true or false. It's often a comparison, something a little bit more complex. For example, is this number greater than some other number? Or is the input value that the user provided equal to this username that we are expecting? So for these kinds of expressions, you can't just have a simple word or a simple phrase that needs to evaluate the true and false. You need something different. you need what are known as operators. Now, I'm gonna admit right up front that the next slide, this one right here, is not the most straightforward one to understand, because so far everything we looked at in JavaScript has been mostly human understandable English, ignoring the weird brackets and parentheses and quotation marks. Everything we've seen can sort of be parsed as a really poorly written English novel, but except for this part right here. These are the kind of things that are actually very domain specific and require you to, unfortunately, memorize what the values are so that you're familiar with them as you need to use them in your own coding adventures. So the operators are the thing that helps compare between expressions to help provide a comparison that you can make. So the first one is equals equals. Is the first expression equal to the next expression? And if it is, then it is true. And if the expressions are not equal, and this helps return a value of false. Then you have greater than or equal to, and greater than. And then you have their opposites, less than or equal to, or less than. Now these two are kind of similar these two pairs are very similar if you are familiar with the things you done in math class many years ago, where you had a greater than or less than bracket, and then you had like a line below it to indicate whether it's the greater than or equal to, or just greater than, or less than or equal to, or just less than. And these are the equivalent of that. Is the first value greater than the second value, or is the first value less than the second value? And depending on what happens, the appropriate clause of the if and else statements will execute. The last three are a little bit more bizarre. It's something that if this is the first time you're seeing all of this, you'll need to have extra effort in memorizing it. The first one means not equal to. It's the first value not equal to the second value. The next one is the double ampersand, which means are they both valued to true? Is the first value equal to true and the second expression equal to true? If they're both true, then the combined expression evaluates it true, and the combined expression is something you calculate with the double ampersand. And the exact opposite of that is these two pipe symbols. And these are pretty interesting in that if either the first expression or the second expression evaluates it true, the entire condition, the entire clause evaluates it true as well. So imagine this being expression, one of these weird characters that you see here, and another expression, and then the overall result of that calculation is what determines whether do something or do something different ends up getting executed. So now that you've seen all of this, all that we need to do is actually put this into practice, write some code and actually see how all of this works. Okay, let's go to our code editor. And what we're going to do is put into practice a lot of the boring theory and slides you saw for the past several minutes. And what our code does is pretty simple right now. I just have two statements, document that right line hello, and document that right line world. And what you see printed on the right is hello world. And the thing I don't want to focus on is we never really looked at document the right line. It's basically a function that allows you to specify whatever you want to print onto the screen at once. And that's pretty much it. And we'll be using this right now as our example to help cement our knowledge of if and else statements. So I'm going to delete everything that I have here. So what I'm going to do first is just write a simple if statement. The thing to keep in mind is that an if statement doesn't have to be paired with an else statement. You can just have an if statement and have everything work just fine. And I'm going to provide my expression, and I'm going to keep it very basic. I'm going to say true. If true, go ahead and write. See, what should we write? This is a true statement to a screen. And obviously this is going to work out because this expression itself is true, which naturally evaluates to true. Let's fade that a little bit. Let's see, var input equals false. And I'm going to replace the word true with the variable input. A little bit more realistic of what you'll see. You'll very rarely ever put true and false into the condition of your if statement. But in this case, nothing gets printed out because obviously input is not evaluated to true, it actually evaluates to false. So if I had an else statement right here, I can basically visualize this statement failing. This is a false statement. And you'll now see this is a false statement appearing. So pretty simple, right? Nothing too complex, and what we've seen so far seems to match what the JavaScript does. Now the interesting thing is that let's start talking about mixing expressions together. Let's actually start using the operators that we saw earlier. So I'm going to put var name, and I'm going to say equals, let's just put Krupa. All right, so what I'm going to do here is actually say if name equals using the equals operator equals Krupa. And what this statement says is that is the value of name, which is this statement, this expression, this value right here, is it equal to what's on the right hand side, which is also Krupa? And if that is the case, then the entire expression evaluates to true, which is correct. In this case, it does exactly evaluate true, Krupa. If I were to change name to Krupa's evil twin, you would obviously see this is a false statement because the statement no longer is true. And by basically combining the expression to your left and expression to your right with the appropriate operator, you can essentially match many situations you run into in your code. So for example, I can say var position, and let's give it a value of, let's say, 500. And I can say if position is greater than or equal to, let's say, 300, then I can say this value is larger. That is, provided I spell it correctly. And otherwise, this value is smaller. Let's make this one. We'll change the value here. But obviously, in this case, the value of 500 is greater than or equal to 300. The value is smaller. Equal to is probably not even necessary. Just greater than is also fine. If I were to say position is less than 300, in this case, you'd see the value is smaller will appear because the false part of this expression ends up coming true. And so that's one extra layer of complexity. So now let's go a little bit further. This goes beyond what we looked at into the slides. So the if-else statements can actually be a little bit more complex than what I've just shown you right here. In fact, your expressions, the only clause is that what you specify inside the parentheses of the if statement, if they need to evaluate true and false. How it gets there is entirely up to you. In fact, I can actually chain together multiple expressions. So for example, if position equals less than 300, and I can just specify, let's just say true, just to keep it very simple. You can now see some other extra code that gets written. In this case, the value is smaller because both its value, in this case, position is less than 300, the value is to false. The ampersand checks if both this statement and this statement are equivalent or the same value of true. Since they're not, the entire expression evaluates to false. If I were to say true to false in this case, you'll see that this value is smaller, gets presented again, because in the end, the end result is again false and to false, which becomes a false value. Let's make it a little bit different. Let's say that position equals 500, var height equals 20. So I'm going to say in this one, if position is greater than 300, which is correct, and height equals 20, these values match. And in this case, that is correct. These values match. You'll see that these values match up here. You kind of saw it earlier when the larger, but the earlier text kind of came up there. But I can continue to daisy chain expressions together because the end result is this whole expression needs to either be true or false. And this falls under, this whole bucket of Boolean logic. And I'm not going to cover all of that in this particular video, but there are many articles and many things on the web that kind of talk about how you can chain different values and how you can arrange your code so that you get the particular outcome that you desire. Now, the last thing before we wrap things up right here, let me just go back to something simple. Let me just go back to if position equals greater than 300 and leave it as that. These values match, great. Now, what I can do is this. Let's say I'm going to deliberately make this the wrong way. I'm going to make this false. Actually, this ends up making it true because position not equal to 300 is actually true. So I'm going to get position equals 300. In this case, you'll say this value is smaller, showing up. So what I'm going to do now is, instead of just having an if-else statement, I'm going to actually add another if statement. It's called the else-if statement. I'm going to nest this even deeper. I'm going to say else if, and I'm going to say else if, in this case, height equals 20. And the structure is very similar. You just have to break up your else statement and just tag on the full syntax of the if statement after it, and you pretty much have something that is good to go. In this case, I'm going to say document that right line. That this one will evaluate to true. So pretty straightforward. And so the way it works is pretty simple. That in this case, position equals 300 is obviously false. So this entire block of line is skipped over. Then the next check happens. JavaScript goes, okay, is the height equal to 20? In which case it's true. at that point, this line executes, and this entire block, the entire if else or else if else block, it exits. If you want to have multiple statements end up evaluating to true and then have them all print, you can't use an if else statement. You must have something a little bit more different, or have a more complicated set of conditions that you then use to evaluate which combination of things evaluate to true. So if we're to have document.writeLine, for example, it'll basically be done, and it'll print immediately afterwards. And it doesn't matter if, for example, another statement evaluates to true, the very first one that gets hit is the only one that ends up basically winning, and that is the one that will end up showing up on the screen in this case, because we're printing things to the screen as things go on. So with that, we're almost done with this video. You just saw one of the first control structures that we have in JavaScript that helps bring some sanity to your code. So before, our code would just run from the first statement all the way to the last statement, but now our code does something a little bit more interesting. It actually takes into account input. It looks at external factors and says, if something is actually true, then I'm going to do something else. And this is the first of many statements we're going to look at that help make your applications not just mindless, robotic, just linear things that just start from the top and end at the end of the last line of code, but actually end up doing something that is more representative of the kind of applications that you want to write, and more representative applications that you probably end up using all the time. So with that, if you want to learn more, go to Krupa.com. If you need any help, post in the forums at forum.krupa.com. You can find me on Twitter at Krupa, Facebook, and YouTube. Post a comment there. I'll be more than happy to help respond to anything you run into. But really, the forums are the best place because of all the formatting, all the cool stuff that you have going on there. And of course, if you like this particular video, there are many more topics that are in the vein of beginners JavaScript concepts that I cover in my book, JS 101, JavaScript for Beginners. I think it's pretty awesome. It's many hundreds of pages of interesting things similar to what you just saw, and it's available on Amazon in paperback and Kindle edition, so definitely check it out. And with that, I will see you guys next time with our next video.